Something walked beside us, visible only as a distortion in the air. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The light seemed to bend at the edge of my vision, like heat rising from stone on a summer day, but there was no sun. The forest was dense and old, a cathedral of twisted trunks and moss-covered roots. Every step we took sank into the littered floor, the scent of damp bark thick in the air, and yet the sound, the small crunch of twigs, the scrape of boots over leaf mold, was oddly muted, or perhaps delayed. Did you see that? Mara's voice was barely a whisper. She pointed toward a faint shimmer that had rippled along the side of the path. I turned, frowning, but the distortion was gone. Only the forest remained. Tall firs and gnarled oaks, their branches forming a near impenetrable canopy that blocked out the sky. The silence was unnatural. No wind, no birds, no distant rustle of squirrels. It wasn't peaceful, it was aware. Watching. I think it's just heat haze, I said. But even as I spoke, I felt the words bending oddly in my mouth, as though the air itself were thickening around me, swallowing the cadence of my voice before it could travel. We pressed on. Mara stayed close, scanning the shifting shadows. There was a sense of wrongness in the spacing of the trees, subtle angles that didn't conform to normal growth patterns. Trunks that should have been perpendicular leaned toward or away from us, roots curled around each other like deliberate coils. We had walked only an hour, yet it felt longer, compressed, as if time had condensed itself in this glade. Then I heard it. A step. Soft, precise, just beside me. But there was no figure, no human, no animal. Only the shimmer, wavering now in the corner of my eye, like heat waves rising from wet stone. It was always beside me, never ahead, never behind. And somehow, it was moving in perfect lockstep, matching my pace with eerie accuracy. Stop, Mara said. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the dappled green light. Did you hear that? I froze. Footsteps. Ours, or not ours. A delay, a mimicry. The soft squish of moss underfoot arrived a fraction of a second before my boots actually touched it. I swallowed, feeling the pulse in my throat. I began, then realized I couldn't finish the sentence. The forest had compressed sound again. Words seemed to stall before leaving my mouth, and when they did, they felt heavier than they should, as if gravity had thickened around speech. We moved again. The path wound unpredictably. Roots appeared where none had been moments before. A small hill curved upward into a false horizon. We passed it only to see the same slope rising behind us, the geometry bending like reflection in warped glass. Mara stumbled slightly on a hidden root. The distortion flinched with her. Not reacting, but anticipating. The air grew heavier, more viscous. Each inhalation carried the taste of earth and decay, old but not foul, ancient, primordial. I became aware of my own heartbeat, thudding against the thick silence, a sound that seemed to echo before it was even produced. I feel like we're moving wrong, Mara said. Her voice trembled. Like the forest knows how we'll step before we do it. I didn't answer. I was watching the shimmer again. Its outline grew slightly more defined, bending the space around it. Light curved along its sides, distorting the shapes of trees. It was not a body, not exactly, but a presence. And it was learning. Always learning. The trail seemed to contract around us. Trees leaned closer, branches arcing over our heads, their leaves brushing against each other in soft, mechanical whispers. Footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes arriving a beat early, sometimes late, as if the forest itself were recording and replaying our movements. Shadows, detached from their trunks, stretching and writhing along the floor, but never leaving the boundaries of the shimmer. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. Time in this place was elastic. We stopped near a fallen log, the mossy surface slick beneath our hands. The distortion remained beside me. I held out a hand experimentally. It was warmer than I expected, not solid, but pressing against the air with a subtle resistance, like moving through water. Mara gasped. It's matching us. Yes, I whispered. Not following. Guiding. She looked at me, her face pale. Guiding us where? I didn't know. But as we walked, the forest confirmed it. A section of trees trembled ahead, slight quivers along the bark, as if acknowledging our passage. A distant branch snapped. Then, moments later, another snapped in perfect sequence behind us. The air warped around each motion, bending sound, displacing space. We passed a circle of stones, roughly hewn, moss-covered, and the shimmer paused there. It was as if marking the moment. I realized then that it wasn't merely mimicking movement, it was anticipating it, correcting it, enforcing it. I tried to lead, deliberately stepping left, right, pausing, but the distortion adjusted in advance, preempting my choices. Every action I took had already been recorded and arranged, a sequence unfolding along invisible lines. The forest was systemic, ritualistic. We were walking within a framework older than memory, a structure we hadn't noticed until now. Mara was quiet, moving with careful precision. I could see her counting her steps silently, feeling for timing in the way the forest bent around her. I did the same, and the distortion mirrored perfectly. I think it wants compliance, I said. Not harm. Does that make it less terrifying? Mara asked. No, I said, because it doesn't matter what we want. We came upon a narrow ravine, its side steep and lined with brambles. The path narrowed to a single track of moss between the roots. The distortion hovered just to my side, no wider than a whisper of air, but I could feel it pressing, guiding. I walked the center of the track, and it shifted subtly, compressing space around me so the walls seemed closer, then easing as I aligned with the proper sequence. Everything's moving to our rhythm, Mara said, shivering. But not ours. It's its rhythm. I nodded. That was it. We weren't walking a forest. We were moving a set of predetermined motions encoded in the land, and the distortion was the interpreter. The sun, or what I thought was sun, began to tilt in strange angles. Shadows warped across our path, elongating, folding back upon themselves. I realized the light wasn't fixed, it curved with the shimmer, bending to illuminate the exact sequence it required. At one point, we reached a small clearing. A pool of water sat in the center, dark and still. I looked into it, and for the first time I saw the shimmer in reflection. Not a perfect mirror, it fractured the image, displacing our forms slightly, creating an echo of ourselves, distorted and elongated, moving slightly ahead, slightly behind. Mara gasped. We're in it already. We're the shimmer. Yes, I said, voice thick with awe. We're participating in the forest's memory. It was then I noticed the markings along the nearby tree trunks. Faint scratches, grooves in the bark, not carved by human hands. They traced patterns of movement, step sequences, pauses, arcs through the underbrush. Some were fresh, some ancient. They were instructions, or perhaps recordings of everyone who had passed through this clearing before us. And it's still adding ours, Mara said. She touched the water's surface lightly. Ripples spread, and the shimmer reacted, shifting slightly to match the disturbance, maintaining the integrity of the sequence. We moved on. Each step was exact, each pause measured, every misalignment corrected by subtle warps in the air, the distortion's quiet insistence pressing us back into compliance. The forest was neither cruel nor kind. It was inevitable. Hours, or what felt like eons, later, the path began to straighten. Trees arched into a natural corridor. The distortion floated beside us, still, almost imperceptibly. I felt a weight in the air, a culmination, a sense that the ritual had reached its conclusion. We emerged into a section of the forest that seemed ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the canopy normally. Birds called from a distance. Footsteps sounded where they should. And yet, I knew. We had walked a sequence. Every choice, every hesitation, every movement had already been mapped, encoded into the geometry of the land. The forest had always known we would come. Mara stopped, looking back. Do you think anyone's behind us? I shook my head. No, not behind. We were never behind. We were never alone. The distortion didn't follow us out. It didn't need to. Its work was complete. The sequence was logged, the pattern recorded. It had anticipated everything, guided everything, and finally released us to the illusion of free movement. I took a deep breath. The air smelled normal now. But I could still feel the memory of pressure in my chest, the imprint of the forest's expectation lingering against my skin. We walked silently for a while, and I realized we were speaking words already known, moving in ways that had been predicted before we even decided them. The forest had observed. The distortion had guided. And we had followed. We were free, in the sense that we were standing outside its immediate influence. But in truth, every step we had taken, every pause, every glance had been accounted for. Every motion mapped and recorded into the living memory of the forest. We left that day as the shadows stretched long and familiar beneath our feet. The air felt lighter. The silence normal. But I knew the truth. The forest had already logged us. We had walked its pattern. We had become part of it. And somewhere, just beyond perception, the distortion waited, patient and inevitable, ready for the next sequence. We were never alone. We were never in control. We saw a figure standing in the distance, but it flickered like a dying light. At first, we thought it was a trick of the sunlight, or what passed for sunlight this deep in the old-growth forest. The canopy above was a living web of gnarled branches, moss-draped limbs, and leaves that barely moved. The air was so still that every sound seemed to suspend itself mid-flight. Even the birds, if there were any, remained silent, as though the forest had collectively forgotten their songs. It was just past the bend in the trail, a faint, stuttering glow, no taller than a man, framed by the twisted trunks of ancient pines. Each time we blinked, it seemed to vanish, only to reappear a few steps closer or farther, as though the forest itself were shuffling reality to toy with us. I remember thinking, at that moment, that the light didn't belong here. Not in a forest where the sun barely touched the mossy floor. Not in a place where time itself seemed to stretch and compress at will. The path we had taken for hours was already unreliable. What had begun as a clear trail, a narrow, leaf-littered track between trees, soon began to warp. Sections of the ground seemed to tilt toward invisible wells. Roots twisted into impossible angles. One moment, we would step on solid earth. The next, our boots would sink into soft, spongy patches that weren't there a minute ago. "You guys see that?" Mara whispered. She always whispered. The forest seemed to punish loud voices. I nodded. The figure was flickering again, this time to our left, behind a knot of birches. Its outline was human, but the light around it bent unnaturally, pulsing, dimming, and sometimes splitting into multiple fragments that didn't align. When it vanished, it left behind a strange distortion. The air shimmered, like heat above asphalt, and the scent of wet soil intensified sharply. "It's just a trick of the light," I said, hoping that it was true. My voice sounded too loud. Too final. It made the moss quiver. But it wasn't a trick. We would learn, slowly, that the forest had a way of teaching you the difference between illusion and inevitability. We pressed on, or thought we did. The path doubled back on itself in ways that made no sense. A cluster of trees that had been to our right a moment ago now towered directly ahead, and the slope we had descended was suddenly uphill. The flickering figure stayed always ahead of us, always distant, always stuttering like a corrupted image in a failing projection. I noticed then that the forest's silence was not empty, it was patient. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence, thick and viscous, pressing against our eardrums and slowing our thoughts. My own heartbeat seemed delayed, echoing like it belonged to someone else. When I took a step, the footfall arrived a beat late, and when Mara spoke, her voice arrived early, preempting her lips. We had crossed some threshold into the forest's mind, though we didn't yet realize it. The figure's glitches grew more pronounced. Sometimes it would be completely solid, a tall, dark silhouette, sometimes its form would splinter, leaving 3 or 4 overlapping images, each slightly misaligned. Each flicker rippled through the environment. A tree would tremble where it had no roots, a shadow would bend toward the figure rather than the sun, small stones would lift off the ground for a fraction of a second before falling back as if gravity had hiccuped. I tried calling out, "Who are you? What are you?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. The forest did. When I spoke, the words traveled backwards through the air. They hit the trunks behind us before they reached Mara, as if the forest was arranging sound in patterns we weren't meant to understand. Mara grabbed my arm. Her fingers were cold, and I could feel her heartbeat pulsing against mine, but even that felt off rhythm. She pointed ahead. It's closer, she whispered. I wanted to argue, but the figure hadn't moved. It was the trail that had shifted again. By late afternoon, the forest had become a cathedral of warped geometry. The trees leaned at impossible angles, their branches forming archways that dissolved when looked at from the corner of the eye. Shadows multiplied and detached themselves, falling across the undergrowth in patterns that seemed deliberate, ritualistic. And always, the flickering figure lingered ahead, patient, stuttering in the light that didn't belong to any sun. We had stopped trying to measure distance. The figure didn't approach, it didn't retreat. It only existed as a node in the forest's grid. Every step we took, every breath we drew, every turn we made, nudged us along its invisible coordinate system. I realized then that the figure was not chasing us. We were walking into it. The light around the figure became more aggressive, pulsing in bursts that hurt the eyes if stared at directly. Each pulse seemed to synchronize with the tremors in the forest. A cluster of birches shivered violently, their bark fracturing slightly as if reality itself were splitting. We flinched at every creak and snap, hearts hammering, unable to distinguish natural sound from forest-corrected anomaly. What is it? Mara asked, voice trembling. I had no answer. I could only feel the figure's pattern, the way it measured us, anticipated us, corrected us. It was less an entity and more a system, a ritual encoded into the wood, the soil, the air. And it was patient, eternally patient. We tried to step off the path, tried to force our own route. But the forest ignored our will. Mossy patches shifted beneath our boots, roots rearranged themselves, the light pulsed differently in each direction. Wherever we went, the figure flickered ahead, like a marker, like a guidepost we hadn't agreed to follow. The anomalies escalated. Footsteps arrived before we made them, shadows stretched and contracted with no relation to the sun, the temperature swung sharply, warm then freezing, as though the air itself were rehearsing some ancient signal. The figure's flicker synchronized with every environmental hiccup, every sensory distortion, until it became impossible to separate cause from effect. By now, I understood that the forest was aware. Aware of us. Not hostile, exactly, but indifferent in the way a clock is indifferent, or a tide. It followed its own logic, and we were just players in its ritual. Night came, but it didn't darken the forest. The figure glowed faintly, and the dim light it emitted painted the twisted branches and leaves in oscillating shades. Shadows formed grids on the ground, grids that didn't align with the trunks. We could hear a low vibration beneath our feet, like the hum of some buried engine, or the slow heartbeat of the forest itself. I can't see the trail anymore, Mara said. I nodded. I hadn't seen it for hours. But the figure was still ahead. Flickering. Waiting. Glitching in a rhythm that felt familiar now. The rhythm of the forest itself. We moved closer, drawn forward despite every instinct screaming to run. Every step was a correction, every pause a misalignment. The forest allowed us movement only to nudge us along the pattern it had encoded. We reached a clearing, or what felt like a clearing. The trees receded into jagged lines that didn't make sense. The ground beneath our feet pulsed slightly, like it had a heartbeat of its own. And there it was. The figure, standing at the center, flickering violently now, a strobing beacon of corrupted light. It was taller than a man now, or smaller, depending on the angle. Its form stuttered across dimensions, one moment opaque, the next translucent, then split into dozens of versions layered on top of each other. And as we approached, I realized it didn't move toward us. We moved toward it. The forest had guided us. The revelation came slowly. The figure wasn't watching us. It wasn't seeking us. It didn't need to. We were the ones moving along the grid, along the predetermined path. Every anomaly, the stuttering light, the delayed footsteps, the tremulous trees, the independent shadows, was the forest nudging us into position. Every warped step we took, every faltering breath, brought us closer to some apex encoded in centuries of wood, moss, and root. And now we were here. We stood in the clearing, uncertain if we had arrived or if we were still being moved. The figure flickered rapidly, almost violently, and in that moment the forest felt alive in a way that terrified me. Not a forest alive with animals or wind, but alive with computation, with logic and patience older than any human memory. It wasn't cruel, it was inevitable. Mara whispered, we did this ourselves, didn't we? I nodded. The forest had orchestrated it perfectly. The figure didn't approach, because it had never needed to. We had been the ones aligning ourselves with the pattern. Every glitch, every distortion, every flicker had been a correction, a signal to keep moving along the path the forest intended. The figure began to split, fracture, and pulse in ways I could almost decode. It was not singular, not finite, not even truly there, in the sense we understood being. It was a node, a vertex, a marker within a structure that transcended us. And then I understood the final, devastating truth. The forest had been waiting for us to reach this point for centuries, or millennia, or longer. The ritual was complete the moment we accepted the path, the pattern, the glitching guide. We were not approaching the figure. The figure had always been within the forest, and the forest had always been within us. I don't know how long we stood there, watching the flicker. The light pulsed in time with the heartbeat of the earth, the bending of the trees, the distortion of the shadows. Mara's hand touched mine, and our pulses synchronized with something that wasn't human. Something patient, eternal. Then the figure began to stutter faster, until it became almost continuous light, a field of shimmer across space. And we felt it. The forest exhaling, repositioning, folding reality around itself one last time. We were still standing, still alive, but we were no longer merely travelers. We were part of the system now, nodes in a network of slow, deliberate ritual that reached into centuries of growth and decay, pattern and pulse. The figure blinked once more, and then vanished entirely, leaving behind only the quiet distortion in the air, the sense of something ancient, systemic, and infinitely patient. We did not leave the forest. Not yet. Not for a long time. We could not. We had walked into its pattern, and it had accepted us. And somewhere deep within the shifting canopy, I could swear I heard the forest laughing, or perhaps just calculating, with infinite patience, for the next time someone walked the path we had taken. The trail ahead had vanished. The trees had returned to impossible angles. Shadows moved independently, and the silence waited. We were moving, but not on our own. We were being guided.